So, hello and welcome to our interview with Lois Murphy. Our students will probably know her from her horror novel, Soon. To all other listeners who might be dropping in, or to new students who are studying different novels in our course, Lois Murphy has spent a considerable amount of time traveling through Australia, visiting small and remote towns, which I think probably inspired her novel Soon quite a lot. In 2017, Soon won the Aurelius Award for Best Horror Novel, and she's currently working on the publication of a children's ghost story, which will come out in April 21, hopefully, and we're all looking forward to that. So thank you for sitting down and having this interview with us. We're very excited.
Thank you.
We've been talking a little bit before starting the recording, and we talked about your writing, and I was just wondering, do you think that there's something specifically Australian about it?
About Soon?
Yes.
Or about my writing in general? Yeah.
Both, I think.
Very.
Both.
Yeah. I would say very. I mean, I've spent a lot of time travelling around Australia, and it's so incredibly diverse and different. It's almost travelling to different countries, different parts of it. So I'm a bit obsessed with the fact that there's so many elements to a single country, which I'm sure is the same across the world. But, you know, it's, my writing is definitely Australian.
And then I guess it's really very much inspired by your travels through Australia as well, right?
It is, but I actually had the idea for Soon long before I travelled.
Right.
I travelled overseas, but I had the idea for Soon when I was back in Melbourne living in suburbia, and my travels around just helped flesh out that idea and inform the book more and create the characters and the scenarios. And yeah, so it did. The travels were very much part of the book, but they weren't the beginning of it.
What was the beginning of it?
Well, strangely enough, after what we've just been talking about, it was a dream.
Really?
Well, it was a mixture. It was a dream that I had, which was actually one of the major scenes at the end of the book. And it was also reading about the story of Wittenoom, the asbestos town in Western Australia, which just hooked me. And the two sort of got embroiled and combined, and I just sort of developed it from that.
I mean, that connection was definitely one of the reasons for us to be choosing the novel to study. So had you been to Wittenoom before you had the idea for Soon, or did you travel there for the novel?
I travelled there for the novel, really. I mean, when I say it was based on Wittenoom, it was based on the idea of it rather than the town itself. So visiting it was curiosity, but I'd already been sort of dwelling on it and thinking about it for a long time. But it was more the whole idea of a poisonous town that was made to disappear. That's what really, rather than the town itself, it was the whole idea of a group of bureaucrats saying, oh, well, you know, this is no good, we've got to get rid of it, and signing off and taking down the road signs and taking it off the maps. And I just found that that just really appealed to me.
Yeah, I can see why. So how was being in Wittenoom then? Could you tell us about the atmosphere there?
Yeah, well, it was empty. It was absolutely empty. It was your quintessential Australian country town with wire fences and fibro houses, and it was utterly empty. The only beings there were kangaroos. It was full of kangaroos.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And there were a few people left. We didn't see any, but it was really strange. It was a strange environment. And one guy had a sign on his fence, and it said something like, what did it say? Keep out, private property, mine. This is my bloody home. Keep out, something like that. It was really, and so it gave you the sense of people being under siege. And that was another element that really inspired the events of and the situation in Soon. But the other thing about Wittenoom is that the landscape was so beautiful. It was incredibly beautiful. I mean, gorgeous cliffs, rivers. It was very difficult to get into because they'd stopped maintaining the roads, and the road was atrocious. But it was a stunning landscape. And we actually stopped and had lunch, and we were having lunch, and we were looking around at all these rocks that were blue, and then we realised that they were asbestos. And so we thought, oh, well, maybe we should actually get out of here. It's not really, because it was quite a windy day. So there was a wonderful sense of, it was such a beautiful landscape, but it was totally poisonous. You know, it was really dangerous to be there. So, I mean, how can you not be inspired by a situation like that?
Yeah, as a writer myself, hobby writer, but I definitely get being inspired by that kind of contrast.
And all the elements of it, the people who wouldn't leave, with the bureaucrats saying you've got to get out. And yeah, there was just so much complexity around it. Anyway.
Well, since you said that you'd like this to be more of a discussion, I hope you don't mind me diverging a little bit from our questions, because you just mentioned the bureaucrats. And in June, there are these people in suits and SUVs who come both at the end and at the beginning of the novel. And I was wondering whether you could tell us something about them, because they're so mysterious, which I guess is kind of the point.
Oh, well, that's interesting, because the editor who worked on the book said that they were a cliche. So I actually had to rewrite them a little bit, because she said it was a bit like that movie Men in Black or something. That yeah, they were meant to be symbolic of faceless bureaucrats, be they developers or mining companies or, you know, politicians who just make decisions under the guise of progress, and decisions that crush people, destroy homes, destroy landscapes, and they're unaccountable, they're anonymous, they're invisible, they just hide behind their suits. It's all business, and therefore justifiable in their view, and the human cost is negligible. Yeah, and that's always been a bit of a bugbear for me. So, and you know, there are other relevant things that have happened. One before Soon was another West Australian town, Esperance, and one day the birds dropped out of the sky, like hundreds of birds just died and dropped out of the sky. And it took the residents quite a long time to get the government to admit that it was because of the iron ore trains travelling through with unsecured loads and lead poisoning in the air, and their children, there was lead in the water, there was lead in their children's blood. You know, it was just atrocious, and they had to fight the government to have any kind of cleanup or retribution. So I think there are far too many of these suited, faceless men in their air-conditioned SUVs who are just so separated from basic humanity.
Right.
So there you go. I'm a bit left-wing.
Well, as literary scholars, I think we're on your side there. And you'll be pleased that our students largely interpreted it the way that you intended it. We had some interesting discussions about these men in suits being representatives of capitalism, and I think that that works very well with what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
This faceless kind of bureaucracy in politics that doesn't really care for people. So that's something
Well,
that
we've just had a case. Sorry, I'm going off track, but
no,
we've
go
just
ahead.
had a case here. I'm pretty sure it was BHP, but I'm scared to say it in case I'm not thinking properly and it wasn't BHP, but one of the major mining companies in Australia just blew up a really, really important Aboriginal sacred site in order to expand one of their mines. And they knew the site was there. It was a deliberate decision to do it. I mean, catastrophic to the people involved. They had their lawyers in to work out the litigation and how they would pay it off afterwards. And they expected to get away with it.
That's
Sorry,
really terrible. So I think I'm gonna combine a couple of questions to get back from from social critique to
sorry.
literary. No, that's really interesting, and it's part of what we're interested in anyway. But just to get back to the literary side of it a little bit more. So you already said that your writing is specifically Australian, but where would you see a difference between, let's say, an Australian Gothic or horror novel and other Anglophone writing, like American or British works, for example?
That's a really difficult one to answer. I think the obvious one is we're so different to the European and English Gothic because we have so little history. You know, we're so young. Our colonised history is so young. We're like a teenager, really. So we don't have the cultural depth of Europe and England. But then America's fairly young too. I think our particular history is so cruel and so based on exploitation. I mean, we were originally colonised as a penal settlement, whereas America attracted settlers and people looking to create new frontiers, whereas ours was very much based on cruelty. And I think that ties in with the landscape in Australia, which, you know, is different, but the vast majority of our landscape is very cruel and dry, and you know, we have lots of things that will poison you and kill you and all of that. So Australia's Gothic tradition is more in the line of, say, an American writer like Cormac McCarthy. I find his books, I can't actually read him, he upsets me too much, but he has that same harshness that I think is part of the Australian Gothic.
Thank you. Are there any Australian Gothic novels or other speculative fiction novels like fantasy or sci-fi that you would recommend for our listeners?
Oh, I've made a list. Hang on, I'll have to refresh myself. It's quite long.
Oh, wonderful.
The ones I would say, not so much Australian, strangely enough, although I would say Janet Turner Hospital. Are you familiar with her?
No, I'm not, I'm afraid.
Her book Oyster is wonderful. That's a real beauty. But the two books that really inspire me most are, and I don't know how to pronounce her names properly, I think it's Mikel Faber, but it might be Michael Faber. And he wrote a book called Under the Skin, and it's just wonderful. And the whole story changes on one word. It's absolutely thinking, what on earth is this woman doing? And then one word just takes it off in a whole nother direction. It is a brilliant book. They made it into a movie actually with Scarlett, what's her name?
Johansson?
Johansson, yeah. But it was very, very arty, and it left a lot of the basic story premise out. It's really, yeah. And the other one is an Italian writer, and again, I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, Nicola Amaniti, and he wrote a book called I'm Not Scared, and that's brilliant. I just like books that sort of take you along on this supposedly tranquil level and then just suddenly turn everything around and you're in this situation that is a complete surprise. Kazuo Ishiguro is another one. Ishiguro is another one that does that. Never Let Me Go. That's a stunning piece of work. Yeah, they're the sort of books that really appeal to me.
Yeah, never Let Me Go. I've read that, and I can see what you mean, definitely. Niccolò Amaniti is actually on my reading list, so I'm glad that you recommended him. I mean, like on my to read list, which is very long, but
yeah.
because I
Oh, look,
know.
I love I'm Not Scared. That's one of my favourite books. There's another, I'll mention one more, who's an American writer, Mark Z. Danielewski, and the book is called House of Leaves. And that's amazing. That's a real trip.
Not that my to read list needs to get any longer, but I put him on there.
Yeah, I know the feeling. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've studied Italian a little bit, so I'm looking forward to reading I'm Not Scared in Italian. I'm not sure whether I'm up to it, but I think it's important to challenge myself with that a little bit, so I'm going to try.
You always wonder about the translations, how much is lost and changed. And
absolutely. Actually, quite a few of our students also do translation studies. So that's something that they're really interested in. Do you know of any plans to translate soon?
I don't know. I know they've done an audio book and I'm scared to listen to it. I haven't listened to it, to be honest, but no, I haven't heard. And I did wonder when you contacted me whether you were reading it in English.
Yes, we are.
Gee, that's...
But perhaps one of our students will want to translate it at some point. So if you hear from people from Germany contacting your publishers, maybe that's us.
Okay.
We think we're going to stick with that kind of topic still. Do you think that there are universal themes that just scare us? Or do you think horrors are different depending on where you're from? Because you mentioned like being inspired from a variety of authors from different countries. So I was just wondering, is there something universal, or is it all very particular?
I would say that it's a mix. I'd say the themes are universal. And I'm sorry, I'm going to jump back because one of the other huge influences for Soon was actually a really bad television drama version of Stephen King's Salem's Lot. There was a scene in that where the vampire floats up to the child's window in all this mist and smoke, and he starts scratching on it with these long fingernails, and the child opens the window and lets him in. And I saw that when I was a child, and I still remember it vividly, and that was a huge inspiration. It was just so frightening. And I think that image of something floating up to your window wanting to come in is absolutely universal. That intrusion and yeah. And we were talking before about the Furies, which are, because I actually think a lot of horror, or for me, is human and natural. It's the supernatural is symbolic for the human condition. And the Furies are a great example of that, because they're guilt and all these things that float up to your window and scratch at your window pane. I mean, it's all the sense of the unknown. It's all the embodiment of fear. And but then it is particular, because if you make it human, there's so much to be frightened of. And I think a woman's idea of horror is vastly different to a man's, and you know, a child's is enormous. I mean, I remember as a kid always expecting something to come up out of the toilet or the bath plug. You know, there was nothing worse than being in the bath when the plug was pulled, that sort of thing. You know, there was just you were just surrounded by threat, and the threat was predominantly imagination. I mean, the human mind is the biggest source of horror that there is.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you there. It's interesting that you mentioned that childhood, the threat is so much more, and that's true because you're so much smaller. And I think I had the same fear of something coming out from the toilet, but I imagine it was probably worse in Australia because there actually are
actually
things that could
happens,
kill
yeah.
you.
But you know the old, you know, when you're a kid, you leap, when you go to bed, you leap from the door because you don't want to walk in front of the bed because something might grab you and pull you under, and all those terrible Hollywood movies or American movies, you know, really plundered all those scenes with, you know, something dragging you under the bed or being behind the door, all that sort of thing.
It's
Yeah.
not really helping
And
with.
so much of horror, no, but so much of horror is the dread rather than the reality. I mean, when you see the monster, it's always a bit cheesy and
Yeah.
cliched, but when you hear the breathing or the footsteps or the door creaking open, that is the real horror, you know, what is coming.
So the threat of the unknown, as you said.
Yeah.
Is that feeling of being more threatened by this unknown in childhood, is that going to inspire your new novel? Or has that inspired the new novel?
The new novel is actually more of a humour one. It
Okay.
was uh, written as a bit of a, I mean, I love the Harry Potter books. I think they're fantastic, but it was sort of written as a bit of an anti-Harry Potter. It was an average teenage boy who just doesn't want to know any of it and is challenged by the dagginess of the situation that he finds himself in, instead of it being a noble thing like werewolves and vampires or anything like that. It's actually something to be ashamed of. So yeah, it's more of a meant to be a bit more humorous.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. Before I ask anything else, just wanted to say this fear of something floating up to your window and asking to be let in. In Germany,
Mm.
there's a children's book series that's called The Little Vampire, and it has a young boy befriend the vampire who knocks on his window in the night, and the vampire is afraid of the dark, so it's quite cute. Um, so that's what I grew up with. A little bit different to that.
Oh, that sounds much nicer.
It is quite nice. I'd recommend it. I think that has actually been translated in English.
Okay, I'll have a look for it.
In the same interview where I read about your children's novel coming out, you also talked about the film rights for Soon being optioned. Can you tell
Mm.
us more about that?
I don't actually know much.
Mm,
They've been optioned, and the company who have bought them are Australian, which I'm actually quite happy about. Um, and they seem to be working on a script. So they're obviously, you know, intending to do something with it, hopefully. Um, yeah, it's quite strange to, I mean, in a way, I have to step right away from it because what they do with it will be their work, not mine. Um, yeah, it's like not listening to the audiobook. It's sort of another step removed.
mm,
So, and I have a very particular picture of Pete,
okay.
and it's going to be interesting to see who plays him and whether I approve. He's got to be quite old and scruffy, really.
Well, I'm
He can't be glamorous at all.
Hugh Jackman. Um,
No, actually, the for me the perfect person would be Willem Dafoe.
okay. Oh,
Yeah,
well, you never know.
fingers crossed.
I'll keep my fingers crossed for you for sure.
Thank you.
So, we spoke to horror author Karen Warren a couple of weeks ago, and
Mm-hmm.
she said that she writes, or she likes writing about what scares her. And I think you've hinted at that already, but does that feature in your writing as well?
I think so, because what scares me is the tenuousness of you know, the life you have, how easily it's lost. You know, there's always the idea that something could come out of the blue or the mist and destroy what you have, and there's always that threat of loss. And to me, that's what I was writing about in Soon, rather than it being a horror novel. It was very much an analogy about loss and just the tenuousness of life and how easily what you have is taken away from you.
Yeah, I think that that comes across really well, especially with the let's say the three main characters, Pete, Millie, and Lee. Was that her name?
Lee.
Sorry. Yeah.
Mm.
So could you talk a bit more about that and ideas of home that you connect to these characters?
Well, I got a bit, in reviews of the novel when it came out, people referred to them as misfits.
Mhm.
And that really bothered me because to me, they weren't misfits at all. I worked very hard to make them very ordinary people who were stuck. And I don't think any of them really fitted the label of misfits. Yeah, I didn't think there was a single misfit in the book, really, apart from Stick. But anyway, they were people with a strong sense of home and people who really had nowhere else to go, who couldn't get away. Because this idea of when something is bad, well, why don't you leave? People don't stay in bad situations because they want to. Well, that was another theme that inspired the book, this idea that a whole town could be told, well, off you go. And yeah, how difficult that would be for people who'd lived there for generations. And it's not necessarily something that you can do. And I think that's a universal theme, obviously. These weren't misfits at all. They were ordinary people who were having their lives destroyed. And that was my real theme of Soon. It wasn't written as a horror novel. It was written as a story about people and their resilience and how they cope in the face of something that they can't understand and don't know, and yeah, they have to exist with.
But I think that's exactly what makes it so scary, this coping with what you can't really escape in that way. So I think what may have caused reviewers to call them misfits is that they are the last ones left in Nebula, and they stick together so closely. And I know that sounds like contradictory, but that seems to make them this community, this little community of quote unquote misfits. So maybe that's what reviewers were picking up on.
I'd call them leftovers.
As the last ones, you mean?
Mm.
Yeah. Coming back to Lee, for her, it's seems to be much more difficult even to leave Nebula behind because of it being her home and because she left home already. So could you talk about why you chose to add her story into Soon, and especially the whole aspect of Cambodian refugees that plays quite an important role in Soon?
And I'm not all that well informed about. I've read a few books, but when I think it was in the 70s, a lot of Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees came to Australia, and Australia is quite a racist country, and there was a hell of a lot of race, and there still is a lot of racism. And so I wanted to include an Asian character who was just as Australian as everyone else and worked just as hard and was just as deserving, you know, and probably more deserving really because of her history and what she'd been through. And part of the inspiration for her was I went to a school where there was a lot of mixed races and we had quite a few Cambodian students. And the story, I think it was included as a dream in the book, but that story I actually heard from one of the Cambodian students at high school about the village elder being disemboweled by the Khmer Rouge and the other villagers having to stand and watch and not show any emotion. That was actually a story I heard at high school from one of the Cambodian students that was there. So it always sort of annoyed me the way Australians so easily dismiss foreigners, and they do tend to. And I mean, I'm generalising, of course, but I think there is a core in our culture of doing that, and a lack of empathy. And so it was important for me to include Lee. And because she'd, you know, by her very situation, being a refugee, had already lived through the mist in another form.
Yeah, I think at least for me, she was one of my favorite characters because of her strength and how she deals with everything. But I was wondering, at the end, or well, towards the end, her relative Alice comes to Nebula, and she has this very different experience with the fog. Could you talk about that?
I'll be honest, that was a plot device.
Okay.
Because I actually stalled with the book about 2/3 through because I had to get Pete back to Nebula and get him back, hopefully credibly, and think of a way of doing that. And the way Alice came up as the way to get Pete back, but I had to have a reason for her to come back. So, you know, the mist was always very manipulative. So, yes, it was, and I thought it was also a bit, I liked the twist of it appearing to her the way it did, in the form of, I mean, obviously the boat, there are all those metaphors for the whole refugee history, and presented in quite a beautiful, well, I thought quite a beautiful way, and a mesmerising way that would appeal to someone, well, I hoped would appeal to someone with a different background, living in a culture quite removed from their ancestry.
The fog starts reciting poetry to Alice, and we were all wondering whether that is based on actual Cambodian poetry, or is that something that you invented for the story?
That was an invention, actually. When I wrote Soon, I was living in a very small town in Western Australia called Carnarvon, and I couldn't find any Cambodian poetry at all. And in the end, I wrote my own. So, yes, but in my defense, you're the only person who's ever asked me about that. But yes, I wrote that. But I'm very taken with I know it's not Cambodian, but I love haikus. And so I wrote it with the form of haiku in mind, or the basis of haiku in mind.
It's definitely East Asian inspired, then. That's actually something that we've noticed a lot with Australian speculative fiction, that tends to look to Asia quite a bit. So
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah, there's a little trend, definitely. I mean, I mentioned before we started recording, mentioned Kylie Chan's White Tiger and Leon Han's Tales of the Otori, and they are both, of course, inspired by different East Asian cultures. So there is that.
It's interesting because I would have thought that we would look more to England, seeing that's our sort of colonial past, and yeah.
Yeah, I read that this tendency to look towards Asia was actually a counter reaction to what you said, to the colonial past and to the previous tendency to look towards England for literary traditions. That was kind of a reaction against that.
Oh, good.
So form, you mentioned the haikus. How did you come up with the content for the poetry that you inserted?
I've always found the haikus that I've read have always been very nature based, and quite philosophical. And I guess I was looking for something, or I was trying to achieve something with a sense of continuum and a view to the ancient, but the recycling rather than, or the moving on rather than the end. That history just keeps repeating itself. Life just keeps going on in the same way. We make the same mistakes, but the Asian poetry is so philosophical about it. And it was interesting because my sister died shortly after Soon was published, and I had to find a poem to be read at her funeral. And I found a Vietnamese Australian poet, and the poem was called The Quock Bird. And when I read it, it was so similar to, well, I thought in terms of themes, it was so much like the poem that I'd written for Soon. And I just found it completely appropriate for her funeral. And no one else understood it and thought it was really weird. But anyway, for me, it was exactly what should be said in these circumstances.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. That can't have been easy. And I'm really interested in that poem now. So it sounds very intriguing.
I'll see if I can copy it and email it to you, because it's a beautiful poem. It's really lovely.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd really love that. On the topic of recycling and moving on and looking at time in a more circular way, I feel that there is a suggestion in Soon that this is what's happening with the fog as well, that it has been before.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, as a writer, I know I've always got more backstory in my mind than I would put down. So,
well, the mist is allegorical. It's it's not defined. It's nebulous. It's basically human history and human nature. Yeah, that's how it's written. And towards the end, when they're trapped in the pub cellar, the mist reappears or appears to them with the sound of thousands of marching feet, which is, a pretty obvious metaphor. And then it turns into children. So it was intended to be allegorical for human history. Yeah. And so that's why it was quite interesting when the book was classified as a horror novel, because to me it was about life.
I mean,
obviously the myth is supernatural, but yeah.
I mean, that probably says quite a lot about human history, that it can be classified a horror novel. So one of the things that made me think that this mist had been in nebula before is these very tiny allusions that you make to there being no Aboriginal presence in the city, in the town. And I think that can be read two ways. One of them would be, the mist has been there before, and there's the disconnect to the Australian landscape that makes them move there. And the other would be that the Aboriginal presence is just ignored. So
well, that's always a possibility. Well, they could have just been massacred, as we do. But what I was trying to suggest there was that the landscape was poisoned. The Maoris have a word, tapu, which is, what's the word? If something's tapu, it's, I can't think of the word now, but it's basically forbidden. It's polluted. It's there's a more spiritual definition than that, and I can't think what it is. But yeah, I was trying to suggest that the area of nebula was tapu. Basically, it was forbidden, poisonous. I think one of the things that Australians ignore with Indigenous history is how well they knew the country. And if there was anything, and they have a very strong, well, in a way, horror or Gothic view of the country themselves. So if there was anything wrong at all, they would be the people that would know.
Yeah, I think that does come across. But when we were talking about it, we also saw these two dimensions, as you said, that it could also be just a fiction, that there weren't any people there before. But I think definitely...
Well,
Sorry?
Yeah, well, that's actually very possible, but my intention was to suggest that, that was a possible explanation for the myth, that the land itself was poisoned before the modern town and situation arrived.
I mean, that makes sense. It makes the mist seem kind of like cosmic, almost Lovecraftian horror, I think, because it's like this ancient and reoccurring thing.
And I always think that landscapes and places hold on to the vibes of what's happened there before. Sometimes you go to a place and it just doesn't feel right, or you feel uncomfortable. Yeah, I think landscapes are very much reflections of what's happened. They pick up the psychic vibes of things. So
yeah, that's an interesting perspective on it. I think that's also quite a popular theory of why hauntings happen, that it's sort of something that's saved in the landscape, or in some cases the houses. So I think that's quite fascinating. Talking about haunting, that's what the mist seems to be doing to all the characters. It's just bringing back with itself past regrets, past losses, that kind of thing. We thought that was really interesting. Can you talk a bit about I don't know, I guess what came into it, what kind of regrets and pasts you wanted to add?
Well, I think a lot of haunting is personal and internal. We're usually haunted by ourselves.
Yes.
So I think it's actually quite a pertinent part of where the threat and discomfort lies. And so the mist itself was actually just a mist, but what it held was, the suggestions of human history and also the personal perspectives of the people who saw it. The mother lives, you know, when she looked out and saw what she thought were her children out there, and she realised that she didn't have enough courage to go out and save them, and that she would leave them to die. You know, just these terrible revelations about ourselves, and that's actually what's hardest to live with sometimes.
That makes sense. And it's kind of what's repeated in the end as well, when Pete refuses to let Xandria, or maybe not, inside. I think that's a nice repetition of that pattern, because you're never quite sure, did he actually cause her to die, or was she already dead? It's interesting.
Yep.
I suppose you won't tell us what the real answer is, will you?
Well, there's no real answer. Who knows? She was out there in the mist, and, you know, maybe she was alive, but it's unlikely, really. But what a decision to have to make. What would you make?
Oh,
what
God.
would you decide?
Yeah. I'm guessing that's the question that Soon asks you when you're reading it, but I certainly don't know how to answer it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Since you mentioned the mother with her kids, and we talked about the Furies earlier on, I think the motif, that's very Greek in some ways, isn't it? She looks at the children devouring each other.
Well, that story, actually, all the sort of horror parts of the myth, the children eating each other, they're all real. They're all informed by things I've read about civil wars in parts of Africa and atrocities, you know, Timor-Leste or East Timor. You know, these things all actually really happened. So, you know, I'd read them and think, oh God, that seems so far-fetched and over the top, but they were actually the true parts of the book, which is pretty horrific, really.
Yes, absolutely. Goes back to what we said earlier about human history being a horror story. But that's so interesting that what most people would probably regard as the most supernatural bit of the book is so inspired by real life. I find that fascinating, because that's something that I'm looking at with my literary studies as well, is this sort of tension between what's real and what's fantasy, and it's not always clear cut at all. So I'm really glad for that perspective.
All these horror figures like vampires and werewolves, you know, they're all just projections of ourselves. Actually, Ursula Le Guin wrote a story that always stuck with me as one of the most, for horror. I think it was in an anthology of Gothic fiction, but I can't remember what it was called. But anyway, it was about a town, very prosperous, everyone was very happy, blah, blah, blah. And then they heard crying or screaming, and they went down into this basement and found a child starving, in rags, filthy, chained up, you know, in terrible, terrible condition. They were outraged, and, you know, we must save this poor child. And then they were told that their happiness depended on this child staying in that situation, and they all eventually backed off and left it there and closed the basement door. And I've always remembered that story. That's what storytelling should be. That's that challenge, and that's what horror is, really. That well, what would you do?
Yeah, and it's this close connection to reality, I suppose, because what you just said, that's not too far-fetched, even the story, I mean.
Well, now it's, very relevant to our whole economic and global existence.
Yes, so. Absolutely. And yeah, I think that's one of the great appeals of horror, this asking these really difficult questions that you can't that you can't really ask very well in many other genres, because if it were realist, I think there'd be kind of, ironically, there'd be more distance, because you could say, oh, this is set in, I don't know, this and that country, and I'm not there and I'm not that person. But with horror, I think you're more likely to identify with the characters. That said, identifying with characters, you chose to narrate soon from the point of view of Pete. And he's not always the nicest character. So can we talk about Pete just a little bit?
Yep. I didn't want to make him reliable. And as I said before, I love Harry Potter, but I really hate heroes, because I think heroes are just too inflated, and they're just annoying. You read a hero and you think, come on, you wouldn't do that. And so I wanted Pete to be the epitome of the person who really doesn't want to do any of it. He just wants to be left alone with his fears, and
His dog.
I just wanted, and I wanted him to be flawed. So, but also, at heart, a nice guy, who does look after people as much as he's able, but flawed. I felt that was important.
Yeah, he definitely comes across as this flawed character, and I think his taking care of Lee and Millie, that comes across really well as well. But since you just mentioned that you didn't want him to be reliable, that's something that came up in class discussions as well. Of course, all of this is taking place online, but a couple of students commented in the forums how they thought Pete was so unreliable as a narrator that they weren't sure anymore whether the fog or the mist was happening at all. What do you think of that kind of interpretation?
I'm quite interested in that. No, he was meant to be unreliable in his lifestyle, but reliable as a narrator.
Okay.
And I guess with his protection of Millie and Lee, he's the sort of guy who is quite happy to be involved with and look after women who are able to look after themselves, but women who need protecting, like Gail, and to a degree Xandria, because she was all surface and pose. Yeah, he just has no time for it. He can't stomach them, but he can cope with strong women. So that was very much a part of his character.
Kind of feminist and kind of not, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I think what prompted our students to think that, oh, hang on, maybe he's really unreliable as a narrator as well, is that in the end you have him questioned by the police as well about what's happening, and there's a strong insinuation that people think, oh, maybe he's been doing all of that. And I think that's what really intrigued our students. It's almost a conspiracy theory. It's like, oh, the fog isn't real. This is all in Pete's mind.
Oh, really? Well, that's really interesting, because no, that was completely unintentional. So I'll have to have another read of the end, and that's fascinating.
I mean, I didn't read it like that at first, but when our students brought it up, I was like, that is fascinating, even if it's not, as you said, intended.
I'll definitely.
It's a great conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I'll have to have a look at that.
Well, let me know what you'll find. So I feel that we talked about trauma already when it comes to the fog, and also about the globalizing forces that are destroying these rural communities. I feel that that's something we already covered when we talked about the men in suits. So maybe we can focus on the ending a bit more. It's so interesting that you have him come back and everything seems to be fine and the birds are singing again, and this echidna, I think, is coming out, and then it all comes crashing down again. As it's quite unsettling. So why did you choose?
Oh, it was meant to be. That was quite deliberate. Yeah. Well, that was basically the dream that I had that inspired the novel in the first place. Was the key turnaround scene at the end. I have really bad dreams and I have really graphic dreams, and yeah, that one in particular stayed with me, and I wrote it down, and that was the beginning of Soon, actually, that scene. So the whole book was written to that scene, and it was meant to be unsettling. And yeah, and it's funny, people either like the end or they're furious because they want it to be explained. You know,
Yes.
they want answers, and that's been a real people saying to me, but whereas it was always my intention not to explain it, because I think part of people's problems is that everything needs to be explained and understood and filed away, and that's not how life works. So
I can totally understand both perspectives there, and I think it must be so gratifying as an author to have this intention of it being unexplained, and then people coming back at you and it's like, but why, but what's happening? That must be quite pleasing.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah. Well, I guess a part of it is the fact that it's been put into the horror genre, so you know, people want explanations, and whereas for me it was only ever a story about people and their situation, and that's often never explained. So
why the animals? Well, you don't have to tell me if you want to keep it unexplained, but why do birds come back? And
it was, well, a bit of a lulling people into a false sense of security, and suggesting that the landscape was back to normal and that it was all over.
So is that the fog's doing? Is like, are the animals just the fog?
I hadn't considered that, but I suppose that that would explain why they're back. That's a discrepancy.
Well, it's not if it's the fog.
Yeah, well, it's the fog now.
You're kind of breaking a law of horror by having the dog be killed, I think. It's like, was that also because you wanted it to be more heartbreaking?
Yeah, that was a deliberate but it was also a way of, again, plot device, like the death of Felix was what finally made Millie agree to leave town. So they were important parts of the story, but it's really interesting because the most common comment I've had from people who have read the book has been, oh, how could you do that to the dogs? And I think, what about Lee? You know,
that's a very good point.
Yeah, no one said, how could you do that to her? And you said that she was the character that you liked the most, and yet no one mentioned her, but everyone was horrified about the dogs. Yeah.
Probably so again says a lot really about humans.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was horrified by what happened to Lee, but I think people being more upset about the dogs might have to do with the fact that most horror stories or ghost stories, or even just, you know, regular catastrophe movies usually spare the dogs. And that's even the kind of trope that you're going against there. So maybe that's what's making people so upset.
I don't. Well, I have to say, I stopped reading Cormac McCarthy because he. What was the book? I think it was The Crossing. Yeah, and if he has no respect for. Oh no, I shouldn't say that. He uses the same. It's heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you know the movie Dante's Peak, but it's about a
I
volcano.
heard of it. But
And there's a dog that's, you know, tiny white dog, I think, and he survives even though he definitely shouldn't by all what happened. And so that's the strength of that kind of trope, that the dog has to survive. So I guess that's making people upset.
oh no, when I finished The Crossing, I was depressed for days, and yet I've read his book The Road, which is far more disturbing in subject matter, but there was something about The Crossing that just was so, so I can kind of relate to people being upset about the dogs. There's just something, there's a sense of responsibility or innocence that we don't carry towards people.
Yeah, I suppose that's true, because Pete is responsible for his dog in a way that he isn't responsible for anybody else. And so that makes it more heartbreaking. Yeah, I think I definitely understand that. The last question I wrote before I read your interview about your new ghost story coming out, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you see yourself writing more novels like soon? I mean, you said you don't really consider it a horror novel, but I guess what I mean is that kind of creepiness that comes across in Soon, that kind of ghostliness, the haunting. So do you see yourself writing more of those?
I wouldn't say no, that I won't, because it's the themes behind them always interest me. And, you know, we were talking before about the Furies, and it would be really interesting to do an updated version of them. And it's quite an interesting way to translate modern themes, because nature's full of horror. I mean, I can't watch nature documentaries, and I love ghosts. I have to say, I'm a real ghost fan. I mean, they're just so much fun. So yeah,
Ghosts are great. I
I
agree.
don't want to be I don't want to be pigeonholed as a horror writer, but I'd still like to be able to play with them. And I guess speculative fiction, it would be a term that I would be more comfortable with, rather than the traditional horror genre.
Well, you'll be pleased that in our course you fit
Although,
into the spec fiction very, very well. So.
although I did read once that horror is mood, and sci-fi or speculative fiction is something like situation. So I thought that was quite an interesting distinction, and I quite like the mood side.
Yes. Personally, or well, we as lecturers for this course, we're using speculative fiction as this kind of umbrella term. So horror is a part of that. But we also talked about the Gothic as a mode and mood, I suppose. So we definitely agree with you there. How that is, it's very much about the mood in some ways. What are your favorite Australian ghost stories? I have to ask now.
Ghost stories, I can't actually think of any Australian ghost stories that I've read, and there must be some. But I can talk about Barbara Bainton, who was an older writer, and she used to write a lot about particularly women isolated in the outback, and her stories, you know, and they weren't at threat by ghosts, they were at threat by people. and they were horrifying stories, really disturbing. In terms of speculative fiction, two of my favourites, and I mean, there's probably heaps out there that I just haven't discovered yet, but there's an author, Robbie Arnott, and he wrote one called, I think, Flames. It's not so much ghosts, but it's got a lot of the supernatural in it, and that's a fantastic read. It's so good. It's set in Tasmania. And another one is Jane Rawson, who wrote a book called From the Wreck, and it's great. It's the history of this shipwreck, and she has an alien in with it, and it just works so beautifully. You completely accept this alien character who was there in the shipwreck and then there as a character, and but it's sort of set in this historical fiction background, and it's just such a beautiful blend of the genres. It's, oh, sorry, this is my cat.
Oh, I love cats.
If you know any Australian ghost stories that you can recommend, I'd be...
Yeah, I can. If you want to, I can send you some scans, because well, the way that we're structuring our course is actually according to sessions. So your novel is in a Gothic session, and we've made students read some some older ghost stories as well. So I can definitely send you a couple of those.
Great.
There's one called the Bunyip that's relatively old, and it's quite creepy. Also has to do a lot with landscape being the danger. So I think you might find that one interesting.
Actually, there's one that reminds me of one that I read when I was much younger, and it's sort of a children's book called The Naggin and the Stars.
Yes.
By Patricia
Wrightson,
that's it. Yes, and there's a really powerful use of landscape.
So you read that as a kid, I assume then? How did that influence you a lot as well?
I would say it did.
Mm.
Yeah, I found it terrifying at the time. It was really scary, and again that sense of ancient foreboding and the use of the landscape. Yeah, I'll have to read that again.
Well, you can let us know how the reread is going.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't actually know all the names of the ghost stories by heart, but I'll send some your way, and we make quite a lot of scans for our course. So there's actually a couple of anthologies, like the Australian Gothic, Australian ghost stories, that kind of thing. So there's a lot to be looked into, and maybe it'll inspire your next novel, and you'll be very proud then.
Oh, good. I'll have to credit you in the acknowledgements.
I think what's going to be my last question from my side is whether there are any other elements of Australian history, like Wittenoom, that you'd like to put in that kind of creepy context.
The only other one that I started making notes about was the nuclear explosions at, I can't think of the name of the place now. It was done in South Australia. And again, there were a lot of Indigenous people in the area at the time, and I did start making notes about making a sort of sci-fi story out of that. And it's just become very current here because there's been a TV drama made around the testing and the whole situation. But yeah, that was a part of our history that interested me. The convict history is just too harsh, and you know, I think it's been pretty well. But I mean, there's all kinds of awful things here. There are shipwrecks where people were eaten, and you know, and the whole history of the pearling industry, where Indigenous people were just sent down into the sharks, whatever, they were just expendable. I mean, so much of our history is based on cruelty and exploitation and isolation. Threat.
So a lot of material.
Yes, yeah, take your pick, really.
So I really hope that we're going to see a lot more of that. As as bad as the history is, I hope that at least it will spur a lot more novels like soon. And if you do write about these nuclear explosions, I'm really interested in reading that. So I said this was going to be my last question. I think I lied a little bit. You talked about nature being so scary. Sorry. Just before this interview, well, last night, I read one of your short stories on your website, and it's the one with the shark attack. I thought that was quite intriguing because there's nothing supernatural there, but it's absolutely, it's scary. It's frightening.
It's one of, up there with, and I think it's far more frightening than any of the supernatural beings because it's so possible. It's and that image from Jaws of the woman swimming with the huge shark coming up underneath her, I mean, that's just, talk about a universal theme. It's just a classic. And I did actually start researching sharks because I thought it would be really interesting to turn a shark into a human character in a novel. So that was another idea that I had that is in my drawer of things to explore, because they don't sleep. They just keep swimming and looking for prey. And it's not that they're evil beings at all. It's just their absolute nature and their reason for being. And that's pretty amazing.
I think sharks are interesting because, as you said, it's their nature. Like, they're not deliberately hostile. It's maybe what makes them even scarier. Even though I just yesterday watched a clip where it said that more people get bitten by New Yorkers every year than by sharks.
Well, and that's so true. I mean, the shark attacks are actually pretty rare. But people are so terrified of sharks, and they're in an environment that people love, the beach and the sea and going for a swim. So they're threatening our lovely holiday or surfing or, so that they take predator to its nth degree, really. There are lots of things that are worse than a shark. I mean, sometimes you come into, I don't know if you get many flies there, but every now and then you hear this terrible noise, which is like a high-pitched screaming, and it'll be a fly in a spider web being wrapped up.
Oh,
and it's the most disturbing thing. It's really, at least a shark just eats you. Oh no, that's what I was going to say. Sharks just kill for food, whereas something like an orca or a killer whale, which everyone holds up as, not nearly as scary as a shark and, quite almost on the sphere of a dolphin, they are cruel. They are absolutely cruel because they think, they engage, and they'll kill for fun. I don't know if you ever saw the footage in one of the David Attenborough. I think it was the last one I ever watched because I couldn't bear it after that. But he did a documentary on the ocean or life in the ocean, and there was a mother whale swimming back with her calf, and they got set upon by a pod of orcas. And it was just heartrending. And the whalers actually used to use the orcas. Orcas would help the whalers earlier in our history to catch whales. The orcas would herd them in. Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, they're dreadful. They're awful. They're far worse than sharks.
I think you should write about orcas.
Yeah, I don't like them very much.
Maybe all the more reason.
Yeah.
But yeah, I didn't know that. So yeah, more things to be scared of now.
Yes. Well, and there's another, sorry, David Attenborough clip of an orca who's caught a seal, and it's like a cat with a bird, just playing with it, flinging it up in the air and throwing it around, and it's just hideous. I mean, yeah, give me a shark any day, really.
I really appreciate how we ended up talking about nature that way, and how much more scary nature can be, how much scarier it can be than a horror novel or ghost story. So I think that was really interesting. I think it relates to what we've been teaching our students as well about the Australian Gothic, because it is so, as you said at the beginning as well, it is so connected to nature and landscape and all that. And I think when we as Germans think about Australia, things in nature that can kill you comes up pretty high on the list.
Yeah. I think we've got most of them.
Yeah, so there's definitely scary, creepy crawlies going around.
Yeah, and sometimes in the toilet.
Yeah, I'm so glad that even when I was afraid that something would come up from the toilet, it most likely wouldn't happen. Is there anything that you'd like to tell us, our students, our podcast listeners?
Only that I really hope they enjoyed reading the book and it wasn't, a chore to get through to the end of the course, that they actually thought, that was pretty good. So yeah, I hope that was the case.
I think that was the case from what we heard. It certainly seemed to be.
Great.
So thank you so much for taking the time to have this interview with us.